Greeks. A people glorious and arrogant, valiant and headstrong. These were the men and women who laid the very foundations of Western civilization. Their monuments still recall perhaps the most extraordinary 2 centuries in history. A time which saw the birth of science and politics, philosophy, literature and drama. Which saw the creation of art and architecture we still strive to equal. And the Greeks achieved all this against a backdrop of war and conflict. For they would vanquish armies, navies, empires many times their size, and build an empire of their own which stretched across the Mediterranean. For one brief moment, the mighty warships of the Greeks ruled the seas, their prosperity unequaled. These achievements which still shape our world, were made not by figures lost to time, but by men and women whose voices we can still hear, whose lives we can still follow. Men such as Themistocles, one of the world's greatest military generals. Pericles, a politician of vision and genius. And Socrates, the most famous philosopher in history. This is the story of these astonishing individuals, of the rise and fall of a civilization that changed the world. BC, 5 centuries before the birth of Christ. In a town called Athens, a tiny city in mainland Greece, pandemonium ruled the streets. The ordinary people had turned on their rulers, demanding freedom from centuries of oppression. At this moment, one man looked on. An Athenian nobleman named Cleisthenes. Cleisthenes had been brought up from birth to be a ruler, to look down on these common people with contempt. But this one night would be a turning point. In his life, in the history of Greece, and in the history of civilization. In a flash of inspiration, Cleisthenes would see that these ordinary people should have freedom, a chance to shape their own destiny, to govern themselves. And with this decision, Cleisthenes would set his fellow Greeks on the path to empire. Historians estimate that Cleisthenes was born around 570 BC. He was hardly the type to become a man of the people. From his earliest days, he had been taught that he was an aristocrat. Ancient Greek for a member of the ruling class. In the 6th century BC, these aristocrats controlled everything that happened in Cleisthenes' hometown, a small settlement called Athens. Athens lay in the center of a Mediterranean peninsula which Cleisthenes knew as Hellas, and which we now call Greece. In the days of Cleisthenes' youth, it would have seemed impossible that this city would soon rule an empire.
It certainly is not what we'd call a city. Forget Manhattan. Athens in the center has public buildings, but otherwise I think one should imagine more village style of accommodation and habitation.
The town was built around the Acropolis, a steep-sided outcrop of bare rock, a stronghold from which the Athenians could fend off the attacks of their neighbors. In the narrow streets surrounding the Acropolis huddled the simple homes of farmers and tradesmen. For these Athenians, reading and writing was a rare skill. There was nothing that we might call science or medicine. Life expectancy at birth was less than 15 years.
I think the idea that ancient Greek life was nasty, brutish, and short would be entirely accurate. Certainly, life was extremely tough.
And this was no society of equals. The common Athenians lived under the rule of the aristocrats. Men such as Cleisthenes' father.
Athens was, in a sense, turned against itself. You had one part of the population, the aristocratic elite, holding power at the expense of the rest of the citizen population.
For the Greek writer Aristotle, this was a world riven by injustice.
The whole country was in the hands of a few people. The hardest and bitterest thing for the masses was their state of serfdom. Not that they weren't discontented with anything else, for to speak generally, they had no part nor share in anything.
Dominated by aristocrats interested only in preserving their own power, Athens hardly seemed a state on the verge of building a great empire. But then Greece also seemed an unlikely land to give rise to greatness.
If you look at the physical world of Greece, it's not the kind of place that you'd immediately expect to produce a great civilization. Simply too many mountains. Greece does not have the obvious kind of physical unity that typically seems to be associated with the really great imperial civilizations of the ancient world.
The great civilizations of Cleisthenes' day lay to the south and east, in Egypt and Persia. They had grown up around rivers and the fertile plains stretching from their banks. But mainland Greece had no great rivers or open plains. This was a landscape riven by mountain ranges. Off her coast lay countless tiny islands. It was impossible for a single ruler to dominate this fragmented world. Instead, Greece was divided into countless tiny nations called city-states, each fiercely independent, each with its own culture and history. And Cleisthenes' Athens was not nearly the most powerful or important of these tiny nations. Argos had stood for over 1,000 years. Her citizens were able to trace their history back to the mythical days of the Trojan War. The Corinthians dominated Greek trade. Their ships plied the Mediterranean, ferrying goods back and forth from Egypt, Assyria, and Italy. But there was one city-state which had military power, which appeared that it might come to dominate all of Cleisthenes Greece. In the south of Greece, around the reed beds of the river Eurotas, lay the city-state of Sparta. The Spartans were brought up from birth to be soldiers, raised in the field, separated from their families, their lives structured around discipline and war.
The center of an average Spartan man's life was his barracks, and he was brought up to be a military man.
The Spartans lived a life stripped of comforts, with few possessions apart from their weapons, and their cloaks dyed red to conceal their or their victims' blood.
Spartans were brought up to put up with anything, and all sorts of stories, the best being of a visiting Sybarite visiting Sparta, eating the local food and saying now he understood why the Spartans were so willing to die, because death was as nothing to eating their food.
The Spartans were ruthless expansionists. By Cleisthenes' time, they had conquered all of the surrounding regions, more than 4,000 square miles. For the rest of the Greeks, the Spartans were a threat always on the horizon. This then was the world of Cleisthenes' childhood. Brought up a member of a self-interested elite in a state that was only a third-rate power. It was an unlikely beginning for the man who would set Greece on the path to empire. But then Cleisthenes had always been a man fired by a dream.